They laughed at the one-armed veteran who warned them the valley would not survive the coming winter. They said the storms had always passed, that the wind was nothing new, that a man living alone near the forest had no right to tell a town how to live. So he left. While the town slept in comfort, he carried timber with one arm, guided by a loyal German shepherd and the quiet faith of a woman who chose to believe him when no one else would. Together they built a massive wooden house hidden near the forest, and the rock hollows designed not for comfort, but for survival. When the blizzard came, it didn't knock. It tore roofs away, it shattered homes, it trapped families in the dark. And one by one, the people who laughed were forced into the storm, searching for the only place still standing. This is a story about faith before proof, courage without applause, and the quiet miracle that happens when someone prepares while others ignore the warning. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and stay with us until the end. Winter arrived in Hearthvale, quietly covering the valley in white, while the wind still held its breath. During the day, the snow looked harmless, soft as sifted flour across roofs and roads, but Orin Halbrook knew better. He had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself loudly at first. It waited, studied, and then moved, all at once. At 46, Orin lived on the outer edge of the town, far enough that people didn't pass his place unless they meant to. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a frame that still carried the discipline of military years, though his posture leaned slightly to the right, compensating for the absence of his left arm, lost above the elbow in a mission no one in Hearthvale ever asked him about. His hair was iron gray, cut short out of habit rather than vanity, and his beard grew in unevenly thick, along the jaw, thinner near the scar that ran from his cheekbone toward his ear, a pale reminder of shrapnel and heat, and a night that never quite ended inside his head. Orin didn't talk much. When he did, his words came measured, as if he weighed each one against the cost of saying it. Most days he repaired tools, split wood, and watched the land. He watched clouds shear apart over the ridgeline, watched snow drift differently near the open flats than it did along the rock pockets and tree breaks, watched the way wind tested structures before deciding whether to leave them standing. People in town called him strange for it, a hermit, a man who stared too long at the sky. Orin didn't correct them. He had stopped caring what people called him years ago, somewhere between the explosion that took his arm and the flight home where silence felt safer than conversation. At his side always was Brim, a German shepherd, just past 6 years old, large even for his breed, with a dense black and sable coat and intelligent amber eyes that rarely blinked without reason. Brim moved like a shadow that chose when to be seen, calm, deliberate, never wasted motion. His right ear bore a small notch from an old wire fence, and his chest carried the broadness of a working dog built for endurance rather than speed. Brim didn't bark without cause. He didn't chase shadows. When he stopped and listened, Orin listened too. That morning, Orin pulled on his coat, secured the strap that held his prosthetic steady against his shoulder, and walked into town with Brim pacing close to his right leg. The general store sat at the center of Hearthvale, a low building with a porch warped by years of freeze and thaw. Inside, the air smelled of coffee grain sacks and damp wool. A handful of locals stood near the counter boots dusted with snow, voices relaxed, untroubled. Orin waited until the bell over the door stopped ringing. Then he spoke. "This winter's different," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The wind's lining up with the valley. When the real storms hit, they'll come straight through. Houses here won't hold. A pause followed, then a laugh. Someone shook their head. Another man, stocky and red-faced, smirked and took a sip of coffee. "You hear that?" he said. "Halbrook's predicting the end again." Orin didn't react. He continued steady. "I'm saying people should plan to move temporarily, at least to the lee side, somewhere the wind can't hit head on. The laughter grew easier, now comfortable. We've lived here 30 years, someone said. Storms come and go. Another added, you're seeing ghosts, Orin, old habits. Orin felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but the dull weight of being unseen. He had learned to recognize that feeling too. It came before explosions, before orders went wrong, before men laughed off warnings because believing them would mean changing course. He scanned the room not for approval, but for comprehension. That was when he noticed Maura Kellen. She stood apart from the others near the window display, tall for a woman in Hearthvale, with a slim, straight-backed posture that suggested quiet resilience rather than fragility. Her hair, a muted chestnut threaded with premature silver, was pulled into a loose braid that rested against the collar of her coat. Her face was pale, weathered gently rather than harshly, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke more of years spent outdoors than age. Maura's eyes were a calm, gray-green, observant. Steady and unlike the others, they didn't flick away when Orin looked at her. She met his gaze fully without curiosity or judgment, just attention. Maura had lived alone since her husband died in a logging accident 3 winters earlier. No children, no family nearby. She kept to herself, worked odd jobs, and spoke politely without inviting closeness. People described her as reserved, but Orin sensed something else in her, something shaped by loss rather than temperament. She understood silence. She understood what it meant to carry days alone. Brim stopped moving and stood at Orin's side, ears lifting slightly as if sensing the shift in the room. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply watched Maura, then turned his gaze back toward the door, as if measuring distances only he could calculate. I'm not asking anyone to panic, Orin said, quieter now. I'm asking you to think ahead. Someone snorted. You build yourself a bunker if you're worried. Orin nodded once. I might. That was all he said. He turned and left Brim moving with him, the bell ringing again as the cold air rushed in. Outside, the wind brushed his face, light for now, almost playful. Orin paused on the porch and looked toward the open flats beyond the town. Snow drifted there differently, thinner, faster, like the land itself was already preparing to give way. As he walked home, memories pressed in uninvited. A canvas shelter overseas collapsing inward under sudden pressure, wind screaming louder than gunfire. The moment he realized the structure wouldn't hold, he shook his head slightly, grounding himself in the crunch of snow beneath his boots, the steady presence of Brim against his leg. This wasn't the desert. This was Hearthvale. Different land, same rules. That afternoon, Orin marked the horizon with charcoal on a scrap of wood, noting angled slopes, the way rock formations interrupted airflow. He had learned long ago that terrain mattered more than walls. By evening, snow thickened and the wind sharpened, not strong yet, but purposeful. Just before dark, a knock came at his door. Orin opened it to find Maura standing on his porch, snow dusting her shoulders, breath visible in the cold air. She held a small thermos in gloved hands. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. Her voice was low, steady. I thought you might want something warm. Orin hesitated, then stepped aside. You're fine. Inside the cabin was sparse but orderly, built solid, practical, every item placed with intention. Maura glanced around, taking in the reinforced beams, the way the windows faced away from the open valley. She noticed things others missed. They don't listen, she said gently, handing him the thermos. No, Orin replied. They won't. Maura studied his face for a moment. You're not wrong, she said. I've seen the way the wind cuts through my place. It's getting worse. Orin looked at her, surprised. You believe me? She nodded. I believe you've seen storms others haven't. Brim sat near her boot's tail, resting on the floor, calm but alert. Maura smiled faintly at him. And he does too, she added. Orin felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar and fragile. Not hope exactly, recognition. I'm thinking of building something, he said after a moment. Away from town, bigger than I need. Mara didn't laugh. She didn't question. She simply asked what for, in case they need somewhere to go. She considered that, then met his eyes again. If you do, she said, I'd like to help. Orin exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. Outside, the wind rose another notch, brushing the walls, testing them. Brim's ears lifted, listening to something far off, something not yet dangerous but coming. Orin nodded once. Then we should start before it has a name. The night settled over Hearthvale, quiet but tense, snow continuing to fall. The valley unaware that one man had already begun preparing for the storm, it refused to see. The wind sharpened overnight, not louder, just more deliberate, as if it had chosen a direction and committed to it. Orin Halbrook moved through Hearthvale on foot the next morning, Brim close at his side, snow crunching under their boots, with a brittle sound that carried farther than it should have. The town looked the same as it always had, low houses, spaced wide, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, fences creaking but still standing. That sameness was the problem. Orin knew how quickly normal could become lethal when people trusted yesterday more than tomorrow. He went door to door, not with urgency in his voice, but with the quiet persistence of a man who had learned that panic made people deaf. At the first house, an older couple listened politely while he spoke about wind corridors and pressure buildup, about how gusts didn't need strength if they had space to accelerate. The man nodded, beard white and neatly trimmed hands, rough from decades of ranch work. The woman hugged her shawl tighter and smiled thinly. We'll keep an eye on it, she said. Orin recognized the phrase. It meant no. At the next place, a younger man leaned against a post, arms crossed, dark stubble shadowing a sharp jawline. His name was Callan Rook, mid-30s, broad-chested, confident, in the way men often were before something had truly tested them. Storms come through every year, Callan said. My dad's house stood. Mine will too. Orin looked at the way Callan's roof faced the open flats. How nothing broke the line of wind for nearly a mile. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Some lessons refused to be taught early. By midday, Orin's words had begun to trail behind him like an unwanted echo. People listened out of courtesy, out of habit, out of curiosity, but not out of belief. A few laughed outright. Others grew defensive, as if Orin's warnings were accusations. Brim felt it too. His posture shifted, shoulders, tightening ears, rotating constantly, as if tracking an invisible pressure change in the air. Near the edge of town, Orin stopped at a small weathered house where a single figure stood stacking firewood with methodical care. The man was Elias Morrow, late 50s, lean, with deep-set eyes and a permanent stoop from years spent bent over engines and farm equipment. Elias had lost a brother to a sudden flood decades ago, and that loss had etched caution into his bones. He listened without interrupting, nodding slowly as Orin explained the wind's alignment. I'll think on it, Elias said finally. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. Orin accepted that. He had learned to value maybes. By the time the sun dipped low, Orin's throat was dry and his patience thinner than he liked. He returned home with Brim trotting silently beside him, both of them carrying the same unspoken conclusion. Hearthvale was not going to move. Not until the land itself forced the issue. That night, Orin sat alone at his table, the lantern casting a steady amber circle against the log walls. He unstrapped his prosthetic and rested it carefully beside him. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly out of habit. He stared at the space where his arm had once been, not with grief, but with focus. The loss had taken strength, dexterity, speed. It had not taken responsibility. He had learned that the hard way in places where failure meant men didn't come back. Brim lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes open. The dog sensed the shift in Orin's breathing, the moment when contemplation hardened into decision. Orin reached down and scratched behind Brim's ear, grounding himself in the solid warmth there. If they won't leave, Orin murmured more to himself than the dog, then they'll need somewhere else to go. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The wind met him immediately, sliding along the ground and up the walls, testing angles. Orin walked beyond his usual boundary, moving uphill toward the rocky outcrops that marked the transition between open valley and forest. Snow behaved differently there. It piled unevenly, caught by stone and roots, broken into eddies instead of long, sweeping drifts. The wind lost confidence, forced to split and rejoin, never striking straight. Orin stopped near a cluster of rock hollows carved by centuries of freeze and thaw. He imagined a structure there, large, heavy, anchored its back to the stone, its face turned away from the wind's favorite path. Not a house for one man. A refuge. The idea settled into him with the weight of inevitability. Footsteps crunched behind him. Maura Kellen approached carefully, her movements deliberate on the uneven ground. She wore a long, dark coat cinched at the waist, practical boots, her braid tucked under a wool cap. In the fading light, her face looked drawn but resolved, as if she had already argued with herself and lost. She held a thermos in one hand, the other gloved hand tucked into her pocket against the cold. "I thought I'd find you out here," she said softly. Orin turned. "You shouldn't be walking alone this far." Maura's mouth curved slightly. "I've been alone longer than that walk." She handed him the thermos, coffee strong and hot. Orin accepted it with a nod. For a moment neither spoke. The wind threaded through the trees above them, sounding almost like breath. "They won't listen," Maura said finally, not accusing, just stating fact. "No," Orin replied. Maura looked out across the valley, lights flickering on one by one as dusk settled. "Then what will you do?" Orin didn't answer right away. He studied the land, the stone, the broken flow of snow. "Build," he said at last. "Something big enough that when they run out of options, it's still standing." Maura didn't flinch. "We're here," Orin said, gesturing toward the rock face. "The wind can't hit it straight. The ground's solid. And you," she asked, "you can't do that alone." Orin met her eyes. "I wasn't planning to." The silence stretched, filled by the distant howl of wind through the valley below. Maura exhaled slowly. "My husband used to say the land always tells the truth," she said. "People just decide when to listen." She looked back at Orin. "If you're building something meant to save people, I won't stand in town pretending it won't matter." Brim stepped forward, sniffed her glove, then sat beside her boot, calm and still. Maura smiled faintly and rested her hand briefly on his head. "I'll help," she said, "not because you need it, because I do." Orin felt that familiar tightening in his chest again, but this time it wasn't isolation. It was something heavier, steadier, purpose taking shape. The next day he began moving supplies quietly. Timber salvaged from old sheds, tools he'd repaired years ago and never used. He worked without announcement, without ceremony. A few people noticed, some shook their heads. Others ignored it entirely. The town had already decided what Orin Halbrook was, a man chasing shadows. But Orin wasn't chasing anything. He was positioning himself the way he always had before things went wrong. By evening, the wind rose again, carrying with it a low, unsettling moan that settled into the bones. Brim stood at the edge of the clearing ears, forward, watching the open valley, as if memorizing its shape. Maura stacked the last of the supplies under a tarp, her breath fogging the air. "This isn't just a house, is it?" she asked. "No," Orin said. "It's an answer." They stood there together, two figures against the growing cold, while Hearthvale carried on below them, unchanged, unaware that the first real decision of the winter had already been made. Snow fell steadily as Orin Halbrook and Maura Kellen began building, not in the dramatic rush people imagined disasters required, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of those who understood that structures meant to save lives could not be hurried. The land near the rock hollows answered differently under their boots than the open valley ever had. The ground was firm, packed with stone, beneath the soil, resistant in a way that promised endurance. Orin tested it with his weight, with the steel tip of a pry bar, with the careful instinct of a man who trusted evidence more than hope. Working with one arm demanded invention. Orin measured twice, sometimes 3 times, before committing to a cut. He used leverage instead of force, built temporary braces where 2 hands would have been faster, and relied on pulleys rigged from thick-limbed pines to lift beams that once would have been easy. His movements were precise, economical, shaped by years of adapting without complaint. The missing arm did not slow him so much as it required honesty. Every task announced its limits clearly. There was no bluffing against physics. Mora became the counterbalance to his restraint. She was not strong in the way Orin was, but she was steady. She held beams in place while Orin set wedges, her shoulders square, jaw tight with concentration. When her gloves slipped, she adjusted without panic. When something went wrong, she didn't curse the work. She corrected it. Her face flushed from cold and effort, a faint smear of sawdust clinging to her cheek hair, escaping its braid to curl damply at her temples. In quieter moments, she tended the fire pit, cooked simple meals that kept them moving, and laid tools out in the order Orin needed them without being asked. Over time, the work learned them both. The house took shape not upward first, but outward. Orin insisted on a footprint larger than any single family required. Thick log walls rose gradually, interlocked with precision cuts that locked weight into itself. The roof angle was severe, pitched so steeply that snow would have no choice but to slide away. Cross-bracing formed bold X-shapes inside the frame, visible strength meant to fight twisting wind rather than hide from it. A secondary door opened toward the forest, and stone, never toward the valley. Even the windows were narrow, set deep, their frames angled slightly inward, like eyes that refused to be blinded by glare. At the center of it all, Orin marked out a wide room, not a living space, not private, but open, almost ceremonial. "People will need to lie down," he said when Mora asked. "Close. Shared heat matters when everything else fails." She nodded, already imagining blankets, bodies, the quiet vulnerability of strangers trusting one another in the dark. The valley noticed. At first, people stopped because they were curious, then because they were amused, then because mockery had become routine. Building a lodge now, someone called from the road one afternoon, planning to charge rent when the snow hits. Another voice followed sharper. "You know he's got one arm, right? Must be lonely up there pretending he's an architect." Orin didn't look up. He drove a wedge into place with controlled strikes, the sound echoing cleanly through the trees. Mora paused, glanced toward the voices, then smiled and raised her hand in a small wave. "If the storm misses us," she called back lightly, "we'll host a dance. You're all invited." Laughter rippled through the group. It wasn't cruel laughter, not always, but it was careless. The kind born from certainty that nothing truly bad would happen. Brim circled the perimeter, posture alert, tail low but relaxed, tracking every movement, every shift in tone. He didn't bark. His presence alone seemed to draw an invisible line no one chose to cross. As days passed, the jokes sharpened. Some stopped by only to watch Orin struggle with a beam, as if waiting for proof that the project would defeat him. Others offered advice they had no intention of following. A few lingered longer than expected, their expressions uneasy curiosity, beginning to compete with doubt. One afternoon, a woman named Tamsin Hale stopped near the tree line. She was in her early 40s, compact and sturdy, with cropped blonde hair and wind-chapped skin that told of years spent outdoors. Tamsin had once lost part of her barn roof during a sudden squall, an event that had cost her livestock and hardened her skepticism. She didn't laugh. She didn't help either. She simply watched, arms folded, eyes narrowing, as Orin guided a beam into place with Mora anchoring the rope. When the beam settled cleanly, no wasted movement, no frantic correction, Tamsin nodded once, almost to herself, then turned and left without a word. The work itself was relentless, cold, numbed fingers, even through gloves. Snow crept into boots, muscles burned in places Orin forgot he still had. At night, when the fire crackled low and Mora slept wrapped in blankets near the wall, Orin sat awake sketching adjustments on scraps of wood, thinking through load paths and wind vectors, his mind working with the same vigilance that once tracked threats through darkness. The house was becoming something more than shelter. It was becoming an argument. Brim slept lightly, rising at every unfamiliar sound, then settling again when Orin murmured reassurance. Once late in the evening, a distant crack echoed from the valley, the unmistakable sound of wood giving way. Brim's head snapped up, ears rigid. Orin stood listening. The sound didn't repeat. Whatever had broken had done so quietly, unnoticed. Orin felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. By the end of the second week, the walls stood tall enough to cast long shadows across the snow. The roof beams waited nearby, massive, patient, demanding precision. It was during this phase that the mockery peaked. A small group gathered one morning, led by Callan Rook, the same man who had dismissed Orin's warnings days earlier. Callan leaned against a post, his dark stubble thick, now eyes sharp with a confidence that bordered on resentment. "You really think this thing's going to save anyone?" he called out. "Looks like a monument to stubbornness." Orin tightened a knot and pulled the rope taut. "It's not for thinking," he replied evenly. "It's for standing." Callan scoffed. "You always talk like that, like you know something we don't." Orin met his gaze for a brief moment. "I do." Silence followed, brief but uncomfortable. Callan laughed it off, but his laughter carried less conviction than before. The group drifted away soon after, jokes losing their edge, curiosity now mixed with something like unease. That afternoon, the first real test came not from people, but from the work itself. As Orin guided a roof beam upward using the pulley system, a support stake shifted unexpectedly in the frozen ground. The beam lurched, weight swinging dangerously. Mora reacted instantly, bracing the rope feet, digging into snow, face set with determination. Orin adjusted the pulley angle, compensating breath-controlled heart pounding. For a moment the beam hung at an impossible angle, gravity arguing loudly. Brim barked once sharp, a warning more than a sound of fear. Orin drove a wedge into place with his full weight, the beam settling with a heavy final thud. Snow shook loose from nearby branches. The moment passed. Mara exhaled, hands trembling slightly. That was close. Orin nodded. Too close. They reinforced the supports without discussion. Mistakes were lessons, not failures. The house demanded respect, and Orin gave it willingly. By dusk, the roof beams rested securely, their mass promising protection rather than threat. Mara stepped back, studying the structure, her expression unreadable. "It's big," she said softly. "Bigger than anything around here." "It needs to be," Orin replied. "People won't come unless it feels solid." She looked at him, then really looked, noticing the strain etched into his face, the careful way he favored his right side, the discipline that never fully relaxed. "You're building more than wood," she said. Orin didn't answer. He watched the shadows stretch across the snow, long and steady, like time itself marking progress. That night, as the wind rose again stronger, now carrying with it the low howl that set nerves on edge, Orin stood outside the unfinished house and listened. The structure creaked, but it held. The sound was not panic, it was resistance. Down in the valley, lights flickered. Somewhere, a door slammed hard enough to echo. Brim stood at Orin's side, body aligned with his eyes fixed on the dark. Mora joined them, wrapping her coat tighter, gaze following the same unseen line. "They're still laughing," she said quietly. Orin nodded. "They always laugh, before they understand. He placed a hand against the thick log wall, feeling the vibration of wind pass through it and dissipate. The house absorbed the force without complaint, without drama. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Behind them, the valley remained unchanged, comfortable in its certainty. Ahead of them stood a structure that refused to explain itself. The jokes would continue, the glances would linger. But the house was rising heavy and unyielding, and somewhere deep in the land, winter was paying attention. The storm did not arrive suddenly. It advanced the way something intelligent might, testing first, then committing fully once it found no resistance worth respecting. By mid-afternoon, the wind had already taken on a sharper edge, slicing across the open valley with a force that bent saplings and rattled loose boards. Snow blew sideways, fine and stinging, reducing distance to a few dozen yards at best. Orin Halbrook stood outside the nearly finished wooden house. His coat pulled tight, brim planted at his side like an anchor. The air vibrated with pressure, not chaos direction. This was the storm he had seen forming days ago, now finally revealing its weight. Mara Kellen came up beside him, her cheeks red from the cold eyes scanning the horizon. "It's coming straight through town," she said, voice steady but quiet. The confidence she carried now had been earned plank by plank, beam by beam. She had learned the land the way Orin had, through attention, not hope. "Night will make it worse," Orin replied. He watched the sky darken too early, clouds compressing the light until the valley seemed to sink inward. Brim's ears flicked constantly, tracking the invisible movements of air and sound. He let out a low, steady whine, not fear, but urgency. As dusk fell, the first failures began. A transformer snapped somewhere down valley, a flash of blue-white light briefly illuminating the snow-choked air. Then darkness swallowed Hearthvale whole. Power lines went silent. The wind, emboldened, rose another pitch. In-town houses groaned. Roofs that had faced the valley for decades without consequence now took the storm head-on. Tin sheets peeled back with shrieking metallic cries. Wooden siding flexed and popped nails whining as they worked loose. Windows shattered one by one, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the roar. Snow forced its way inside, coating floors, burying furniture, turning shelter into exposure. Callan Rook stood in his living room, staring at the ceiling as it began to bow. He was pale now, his confidence stripped away by physics. When a beam cracked overhead, he didn't wait to argue with it. He grabbed his coat and stumbled outside, joining others already moving blindly through the whiteout. Tamsin Hale fought her door as it threatened to rip from its hinges, her compact frame straining as she forced it shut long enough to retrieve a flashlight and a blanket. Her jaw clenched with a familiar, bitter recognition. She had seen storms take things before. She had just never believed one would take everything at once. Elias Morrow helped his wife into her boots. With shaking hands, every movement slowed by cold and fear. His stooped posture made the wind catch him harder, nearly knocking him off balance as they stepped outside. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The valley that had felt open and familiar hours earlier had transformed into a featureless void. People called out to one another, voices thin and quickly stolen by the storm. Someone fell. Another screamed, the sound ending abruptly. Panic spread not as noise but as motion figures, stumbling forward because standing still felt worse than moving blind. Then a bark cut through the chaos. Brim emerged from the white like a living arrow, his dark shape sharp against the snow. He ran ahead, stopped, barked again, then turned back, nudging a man's leg with his muzzle, urging him forward. When the man hesitated, Brim caught the edge of his coat gently and pulled just enough to guide, not drag. "Orin," someone shouted the name, breaking apart in the wind. At the edge of the forested rise, Orin had already thrown the heavy door open. The gust that followed slammed into the structure with brute force, only to splinter and dissipate as the rock face and angled walls did their work. Inside, firelight glowed steady and prepared. Mora moved quickly, laying blankets near the wide central room, setting kettles on iron stands, her hands trembling but precise. "They're coming," Orin said, not as a question. Mora nodded. "I know." The first group reached the house just as full whiteout descended. Shapes collided with the outer wall, hands searching desperately until they found the doorway. Orin grabbed shoulders, pulled bodies inside, his one arm straining, his stance wide and unyielding. Brim darted back and forth between the door and the storm, guiding, barking, returning again and again. One woman collapsed just inside the threshold, her hair white with frost, eyes unfocused. Mora knelt instantly, wrapping her in blankets, murmuring reassurances. A child clung to his father's legs, sobbing silently, tears freezing on his cheeks. Orin ushered them toward the central room where bodies already lay, close together, sharing warmth. The wind howled outside, frustrated now, battering the house with renewed fury. Inside, the logs creaked but held. Cross-bracing absorbed the twisting force. Snow slid harmlessly from the steep roof in heavy sheets. The house did not fight the storm. It redirected it. More people arrived in waves, each group smaller than the last, until finally there were no more figures emerging from the white. Orin closed the door, sealing out the storm as best he could. Brim stood facing it, chest-heaving, ears pinned forward, guarding as if the wind itself might attempt one last intrusion. The room filled with the sounds of sorrowful, ragged breathing, quiet sobs, murmured prayers, the crackle of fire. Pride lay somewhere outside, with the broken fences and scattered shingles. Callan Rook sat against the wall, head in his hands, dark stubble rimed with ice. He looked up at Orin, once shame etched clearly across his face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Orin met his gaze briefly, then moved on. This was not a night for apologies. Hours passed without measure. Time dissolved into heat checks, water passed hand to hand, bodies shifting closer as the temperature outside plunged further. Mara moved among them tirelessly, her earlier reserve replaced by a quiet authority that surprised even herself. She had always survived alone. Tonight she was part of something larger, and she did not shrink from it. Near dawn, the wind finally began to falter, not end, just weaken, its fury spent. The whiteout thinned shadows re-emerging where the world still existed. Inside the house, exhaustion settled heavily. People slept where they lay, breaths shallow but steady. Orin remained awake. He stood near the door, listening, counting gusts, feeling the vibration through the walls. The house had done what he built it to do. It had stood. Mora joined him, wrapping her coat tighter. "They lived," she said quietly. "Yes," Orin replied. The word carried weight. She looked at him, then really looked, seeing the strain, the quiet resolve, the man who had chosen responsibility over comfort again and again. "They'll remember this," she said. Orin didn't answer. He wasn't sure memory was reliable, but consequence was. As the first pale light crept through the narrow windows, the storm withdrew, leaving behind a valley reshaped by force and humility. Hearthvale would never look the same again. Neither would the people inside the wooden house who had survived, because one man refused to laugh along with them. Brim lay down at Orin's feet, at last exhaustion overtaking vigilance. Orin rested his hand against the thick log wall, feeling the residual warmth, the proof of preparation made real. Outside, pride lay broken. Inside, something quieter and stronger had taken its place. Morning revealed Hearthvale the way truth often does, without mercy, but with clarity. Snow lay everywhere, smooth in some places, torn and ridged in others, where the wind had clawed at the land. Roofs were missing shingles or entire sections. A few barns leaned at unsafe angles, their doors twisted open like broken jaws. Trees lay snapped along the ridgeline, branches scattered as if tossed aside by something careless and strong. Yet amid the damage, one fact stood unshaken: the people were alive, and most of them were standing inside the big wooden house Orin Halbrook had built. The interior smelled of smoke, wet wool, and boiled grain. Bodies filled the wide central room, wrapped in blankets, sitting shoulder to shoulder the way Orin had imagined they would long before anyone believed him. Faces were pale, but breathing was steady. Children slept against parents. Older men stared quietly at the floor, hands clasped, as if afraid to let go of the moment. Brim lay stretched across the doorway, massive and still, his chest rising and falling with slow authority. His amber eyes followed every movement, not with suspicion, but with a watchfulness earned through the night. Orin stood near the far wall, leaning lightly against a thick log beam. His hair was dusted with ash and frost, his beard uneven with exhaustion. Dark circles framed his eyes, but they were alert, present. He watched the room not as its owner, but as its guardian, checking details the way he always did, who shivered, who didn't, where heat pooled, where it thinned. The house had held. That was enough for now. Mara moved among the people with a quiet efficiency that surprised even her. She carried a pot of soup ladled from the fire pit, her steps careful, her posture upright despite fatigue. She knelt beside a woman with a scraped cheek, dabbing it gently, murmuring reassurances. The woman nodded, tears slipping free, not from pain but from the shock of having survived. Mora's face was calm, her gray-green eyes focused, her hands steady. She did not hurry, she did not dramatize. She simply did what needed doing. Callan Rook sat near the center, wrapped in a blanket too small for his broad frame. The dark stubble on his jaw was wet with melted snow, his shoulders slumped in a way no one in Hearthvale had ever seen before. When his eyes met Orin's, he looked away first. Pride had not survived the storm. Shame lingered raw and unspoken. Tamsin Hale stood near a window, arms crossed, surveying the damage outside. Her cropped blonde hair stuck out in uneven tufts, her face drawn but composed. She turned slowly, eyes tracing the lines of the house, the thick walls, the bracing, the way the roof had shed snow cleanly. "You built it right," she said finally, her voice low. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. Elias Morrow helped his wife to her feet, moving carefully, his stooped back more pronounced now, but his hands gentle. He glanced at Orin, then nodded once deeply. Elias had always understood consequences. He understood them better now. As the morning wore on, the storm's final breath faded into a distant hush. The wind no longer roared. It whispered. Hearthvale began to move again cautiously, like an animal testing an injured limb. People ventured outside in small groups, returning with reports: this house damaged, that fence gone, this path blocked. Orin listened, absorbing information without comment. Then he spoke. "We'll fix what we can," he said. "Together." No one laughed. By midday, the first repairs began. Men who had once mocked Orin's effort now carried planks, reset posts, cleared snow from collapsed sheds. Women organized supplies, counted blankets, boiled more water. No one asked who was in charge. They simply followed the man who had prepared when preparation felt unnecessary. Mara worked beside Orin, handing him tools, steadying boards, coordinating without needing to say much. Their movements had learned each other. When Orin paused, Mara anticipated why. When Mara hesitated, Orin adjusted. It wasn't intimacy in the way stories often described it. It was something quieter, stronger, a partnership forged under pressure, not romance. As evening approached, the valley softened. Snow fell lightly now, the kind that drifted down rather than attacked. Lanterns were hung along the interior beams of the big house, their warm light turning rough wood into gold. Someone found an old radio, battered but functional, and coaxed a thin melody from it, an old song, slow and familiar, its words mostly lost to static. People gathered closer, drawn by warmth and the comfort of sound. A table was set near the fire, not fancy, just boards laid across barrels, bowls filled with shared food. Someone laughed softly at first, then louder, relief loosened tongues. Stories surfaced where people had been when the roof tore away, who had helped whom, how close it had all come. At some point, someone no one ever remembered who said it aloud. This house saved the whole town. A pause followed. Then another voice added gentler, maybe it's time it saved 2 people too. Maura froze, cheeks coloring instantly. She straightened, smoothing her coat, eyes flicking toward Orin and away again. Orin caught completely unprepared, felt heat rise into his face that had nothing to do with the fire. He cleared his throat, then stopped, realizing there was nothing he needed to say. The room wasn't laughing at them. It was smiling. Brim chose that moment to stand and trot over, tail swaying in an unmistakable rhythm. He placed himself squarely between Orin and Maura, then looked up at them both, ears relaxed, expression open. Someone chuckled. Even the dog agrees. Maura laughed, then a soft sound that carried more weight than the storm ever had. Orin looked at her, really looked, seeing not just the woman who had helped him build a refuge, but the woman who had stood beside him when belief was thin and effort was heavy. He saw the lines of loss she carried, the strength she hadn't advertised, the way her presence had eased something knotted deep inside him. "I didn't plan for this," Orin said quietly, mostly to himself. Maura met his eyes. "Neither did I," she replied. "But I'm not afraid of it. That was all it took. Not a promise, not a declaration, just truth spoken plainly." Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle now, indifferent to human moments. Inside, something shifted, subtle but lasting. The house had done more than keep people alive. It had changed the way they saw one another, the way they understood responsibility, the way they defined strength. Later, when the lanterns burned low and people drifted home to whatever shelter they had left, Orin stood on the porch with Maura and Brim. The valley lay quiet beneath the snow, humbled but breathing. Smoke rose from repaired chimneys, thin but steady. "They'll want to build more," Maura said. "Places like this." Orin nodded. "I'll show them how." Brim leaned against Orin's leg, warm and solid. Orin rested his hand on the dog's head, then glanced at Maura. "We'll need help," he said. She smiled. "You already have it." They stood there together, not framed as heroes, not as saviors, but as 2 people who had chosen to act when inaction was easier. The house behind them stood silent and strong, its purpose fulfilled and expanded. Winter would return. Storms always did. But Hearthvale would meet them differently, now prepared, connected, no longer laughing at warnings, until it was too late. And inside the big wooden house, warmth lingered long after the fire dimmed, a promise built not from miracles but from courage, labor, and the quiet decision to care for one another before the storm arrived. In the end, the miracle was never the storm stopping. It was that someone listened before it arrived. Sometimes God does not send thunder or visions. Sometimes he sends a quiet warning placed in the heart of one ordinary person, a thought that won't let go, a sense of responsibility that feels heavier than comfort. The miracle is not that walls stand against the wind, but that a human soul chooses to prepare, to care, and to act when others laugh. Orin did not pray for applause. Maura did not ask for rescue. They simply showed up, worked with what they had, and trusted that doing the right thing early mattered. And when the storm came, God did not erase the wind. He turned preparation into protection. He turned labor into shelter. He turned one man's quiet courage into a refuge for many. In our daily lives, storms come too: illness, loneliness, fear, loss, moments when the world feels louder than our strength. And often the help we're praying for looks like a chance to build something: patience, kindness, readiness, or a place of warmth for someone else. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a simple comment below just to say you were here with us in this story. And if stories of resilience, faith, loyalty, and second chances speak to your heart, Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you and your household. May He give you wisdom before the storm, strength during it, and peace after it passes. And may you never underestimate the miracle of choosing to care before it's too late.